in a quiet village surrounded by golden fields and olive trees. A father worked hard every day, watching over his land and his 2 sons. His home was filled with love, stability, and wisdom, a place where faith and family were everything. But one day, the peace of that home was shattered. The younger son, restless and burning with desire for independence, came to his father with a shocking request. "Father, give me my share of the inheritance now." It was a demand that broke tradition and his father's heart. Yet, without anger, the father agreed. He divided his estate, giving the younger son what he asked for. With pockets full of wealth and dreams of freedom, the young man turned his back on home. He walked away from love, guidance, and security, convinced that happiness waited somewhere far beyond his father's reach. He traveled to a distant land, a place of music, laughter, and indulgence. There, he spent his fortune chasing pleasure, surrounded by people who praised him for his riches but cared nothing for his soul. For a while, life seemed perfect. He had everything he thought he wanted: freedom, excitement, and endless nights of celebration. But soon, his gold ran out. The friends who once smiled at him vanished. The bright lights dimmed, and reality returned like a cold wind through empty streets. Alone and penniless, he faced the harsh truth: he had traded love for loneliness, wisdom for waste, and faith for fleeting joy. He had everything, and now he had nothing. This is not just a story from the past. It is a reflection of human nature. How often do we chase after illusions of happiness, only to find ourselves lost and broken? The parable of the prodigal son reminds us that no matter how far we wander, the door to forgiveness is never closed. Before we continue this powerful story of rebellion, loss, and redemption, take a moment to support our channel. Click like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next inspiring Bible story. Each episode brings ancient wisdom to life, stories that remind us of mercy, hope, and the power of faith. Stay with us as we follow the journey of the lost son, a journey from pride to pain, and from despair to grace. The young man's early days in the distant city had been a blur of celebration and excitement. Gold coins glimmered in his hands, and with every purchase, every feast, every lavish night surrounded by laughter and strangers who called themselves friends, he felt unstoppable. The noise of the city drowned out the faint voice of his conscience, the quiet reminders of home, and the memory of his father's gentle eyes. He believed he had finally found freedom, unshackled from rules, expectations, and the patient love that once held him safe. But freedom without wisdom is a fragile illusion, and like sand slipping through his fingers, his fortune began to fade faster than he ever imagined. The days of abundance soon blurred into nights of exhaustion. The tables that once overflowed with food were now empty, and the faces that once smiled at him disappeared. The same people who had cheered his generosity now looked away when he passed. His fine clothes lost their shine, his laughter grew hollow, and his confident stride turned into a weary shuffle. When the last of his coins was gone, he felt an unfamiliar weight, hunger. It crept into his body and his pride, gnawing at both. Then, as if the heavens themselves wanted to test the depth of his fall, a famine swept through the land. The once lively city grew silent. Markets closed. The scent of fresh bread vanished, and desperation filled the air. Food became more precious than gold. The young man, once proud and careless, now wandered through the streets with an empty stomach and trembling hands. He knocked on doors that refused to open, searching for work, for kindness, for anything that could keep him alive. Each refusal reminded him of how far he had fallen from the comfort of his father's house, where servants were never hungry and compassion was never scarce. At last, He found a man willing to hire him, but not out of mercy, out of need. His new task was feeding pigs in a muddy field far from the city. To the son of a Jewish household, it was the lowest and most humiliating labor possible. The animals grunted and pushed around him as he poured their food. And there were moments when he looked at the pods they ate and felt the sharp pain of envy. No one offered him food. No one offered him friendship. No one saw him as the young man he once was. He was a shadow, a forgotten soul surviving on regret and memory. Every night he lay down in the dirt, looking at the stars that once seemed full of promise. Now, they looked distant and cold. His mind drifted to his father's house, the warmth of the hearth, the laughter of his brother, the servants carrying baskets of bread, the smell of roasted grain. He remembered how his father would bless the meal, his hands steady and kind. A lump rose in his throat, and tears burned his eyes. He had walked away from love thinking he could find joy in the world. But the world had taught him a cruel truth: freedom without guidance can destroy a soul faster than chains ever could. As hunger gnawed at him and shame weighed on his spirit, he began to speak to himself softly, the words trembling in the cold air. How many of my father's servants have food to spare? And here I am dying of hunger. The realization struck him with a clarity that no amount of pain could cloud. He had sinned not just against his father, but against heaven itself. He had taken his blessings and wasted them, traded love for emptiness, wisdom for pride. Yet even in that darkness, a small light flickered inside him, the hope that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness still waited for him. He imagined his father's face, not in anger, but in sorrow, and the thought filled him with both fear and longing. The memory of his father's patience, his quiet strength, stirred something that had long been buried beneath arrogance and pleasure. The son began to understand that love is not something to escape from, but something to return to. He had left home chasing independence. Yet now, broken and humbled, he craved nothing more than to be near his father again, even as a servant, even as a beggar. As dawn approached, he rose from the muddy ground. His body was weak, his clothes torn, but within him, a decision had taken root. He would return home, not to demand, but to confess. He would fall at his father's feet and say the words that had burned in his heart all night. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. The path back would be long, filled with uncertainty, but he no longer feared the journey. For the first time in years, his steps were not driven by pride or greed, but by repentance. As he began his walk home, the rising sun painted the horizon with soft light, and with each step, the weight of his choices pressed against him. Yet beneath that burden was something new: peace. He had lost everything the world had to offer, but in that loss, he had found something the world could never give: the understanding that true freedom lies not in running away, but in returning to love. The morning light crept over the barren fields, casting long shadows across the dirt where the young man sat in silence. His body was weak from hunger, his clothes torn, and his spirit hollowed by shame. For days, he had lived among the pigs, his hands and face smeared with the same mud they wallowed in. Each breath carried the sore smell of decay, and each heartbeat echoed the truth he had tried to ignore. He had lost everything: not only his fortune, but the very sense of who he was. The laughter of his old life, the glitter of gold, the sound of music that once surrounded him had vanished, leaving behind only the wind and the ache of regret. At first, he tried to convince himself that things would change, that maybe fortune would smile on him again. But as the days stretched into emptiness and the nights grew colder, hope seemed like a stranger. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and loneliness settled into his soul. He began to see the faces of those who had abandoned him, the same ones who had once called him a friend when his purse was full. And then, as if summoned from the depths of memory, another face came to him, his father's. He saw it clearly now, not stern or angry, but gentle, patient, and full of love. He remembered the mornings when his father walked through the fields, blessing the workers with kind words. He remembered the sound of his father's laughter at the dinner table, the warmth that filled their home, and the steady voice that had always guided him toward wisdom. These memories struck him harder than hunger ever could. He had left all of that behind, believing he could create a better life on his own. But now he realized how blind he had been. As the young man sat there, tears began to well in his eyes. The dirt on his face mixed with them, creating streaks down his cheeks. But he did not care. For the first time since leaving home, he allowed himself to feel everything: guilt, sorrow, and a deep longing to be forgiven. His pride, once as unyielding as stone, began to crumble. He whispered to himself in a trembling voice, "What have I done?" The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. It was not just the loss of wealth that pained him, but the knowledge that he had wounded the one who had loved him most. In that moment of brokenness, something began to shift within him. He remembered how his father used to tell him that rules were not chains meant to bind, but guides meant to protect. He had not understood then. He had mistaken structure for restriction, discipline for domination. Now, covered in rags and mud, he finally saw the truth. Freedom without purpose is emptiness. Rebellion without love is ruin. His father's house had not been a prison, but a place of belonging, and he had traded that for isolation. A gentle breeze swept across the field, carrying with it the faint scent of the earth after rain. The young man lifted his head and looked toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills was the home he had abandoned, the place where forgiveness might still dwell. Yet fear lingered in his chest. What if his father rejected him? What if the door was closed, and his name was no longer welcome? The thought pierced him deeply. But then he remembered the tenderness in his father's eyes, the patience that had always seemed endless. Could that love truly have disappeared? He doubted it. Deep down, he knew his father's heart too well. He began to speak again, rehearsing the words he would say when he saw his father. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am not worthy to be called your son." The words hurt to say, but they also brought relief, like a wound finally being cleaned. He did not expect restoration or honor. He wanted only mercy. Even to be a servant in his father's house would be better than this life of despair. At least there, he would be close to kindness again. The decision to return was not made in haste. It was the product of days of reflection and nights of sorrow. As he stood, his body trembled from weakness, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. Each step he took away from the pigsty was a step toward humility, a quiet act of repentance. The road ahead would be long, and he had nothing to offer: no gold, no gifts, no pride, only the truth of a heart ready to change. As he began the journey, the sun rose higher, warming the land and his spirit. The landscape stretched before him, vasty, but for the first time, he did not see it as a punishment. Every mile between him and home was a chance to shed a layer of his past. He walked slowly, barefoot and bruised, each footstep a silent confession. Birds flew overhead, and though he had not noticed them before, now he found peace in their freedom, not the reckless kind he once sought, but the freedom that comes with trust. He thought of how his father might react, how the servants might whisper when they saw him return. Yet, with every thought, his determination grew. It was no longer about how the world would see him. It was about facing the truth with honesty and courage. Repentance was not just admitting guilt, it was choosing love again, choosing humility over pride, and trust over fear. The young man knew he could never undo the past, but he could walk toward redemption. And though he still carried the weight of his mistakes, a quiet strength began to bloom within him, the kind that only comes from knowing grace is possible. The The same grace that once protected him waited now to welcome him home. The morning sun had climbed higher, painting the distant hills with golden light. Yet the young man's heart still carried the shadows of the nights spent in despair and hunger. Each step away from the mud-filled pen where he had fed pigs was heavy with the memory of his own recklessness. But it was also lighter than it had been for years. Buoyed by the fragile hope that his father's love might still await him, the path before him was long and uncertain, winding through fields and villages that seemed indifferent to the misery of one small, wandering soul. Yet he moved forward with a resolve that had never been necessary in the life he once knew. The humility he carried now was a cloak heavier than any robe of wealth. Yet somehow it warmed him in a way he had never felt among riches or fleeting pleasures. As he walked, he rehearsed the words that had formed in his heart through countless nights of reflection. Words that were meant not to demand, but to plead. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He spoke them softly under his breath, each repetition a layer of courage being built, a preparation for the moment when he would face the one he had disappointed most. The thought of his father's eyes, would they be filled with anger? Or would they hold the same tenderness that had nurtured him since childhood? The young man dared to hope, though fear still whispered doubts. Yet even fear could not stop the momentum of repentance. That quiet but powerful force that compelled him to leave behind the last vestiges of pride and self-deception. The journey was not just a physical one, but a passage through memory and realization. Each mile a reflection on the choices that had led him here. He remembered the laughter of his siblings, the gentle guidance of his father, the warmth of the hearth that had once been the center of his world. He could almost hear the songs of the household servants as they moved through the morning routines, the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat mingling with the smoke of the fire. These memories, once taken for granted, now felt like treasures more valuable than all the gold he had squandered. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that true fulfillment was not found in extravagance or freedom from rules, but in love, connection, and the steady presence of someone who believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. As he approached the outskirts of his father's property, a mix of anticipation and dread pressed upon him. He slowed his pace, feeling the crunch of dry grass beneath his feet as though each sound carried the weight of years of mistakes. The gates of his home were visible in the distance, framed by olive trees and the gentle rise of the hills he had once known so well. The house itself seemed unchanged, a steadfast beacon amid the shifting tides of his own life. And the sight of it brought tears that he could no longer hold back. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, feeling the mud and sweat of the journey as marks not just of hardship, but of transformation, proof that he had endured and reflected, and now sought reconciliation. The prodigal son's heart raced as he moved closer, rehearsing again the humility with which he would enter. He did not envision a grand welcome or the immediate restoration of status. He was prepared to ask to become a hired servant, to toil alongside those who had remained loyal while he had wandered. The thought of serving in the house he had abandoned filled him with both shame and relief, for it represented a tangible acknowledgement of his failures, a willingness to accept the consequences of choices made in folly. Yet even in this submission, there was a quiet courage, the courage to confront himself, to face the judgments of others, and to step into the unknown with faith that his father's heart might mirror the mercy he had glimpsed in memory. As he drew near, he paused, taking in the familiar details of the courtyard, the stone paths worn smooth by years of footsteps, and the fig trees that had shaded him as a child. Each element of the home seemed to whisper reminders of the life he had taken for granted. And with every reminder, his determination solidified. He could not undo the past. He could not erase the time squandered. But he could choose how to meet the present, and how to step into a future guided by repentance and the hope of forgiveness. The gates opened slightly as though anticipating his arrival, and he felt the weight of hesitation settle for a moment before he pressed onward. His footsteps were measured, each one a declaration that he had learned humility, that he carried no pretense, and that he sought not privilege but restoration. In the distance, he thought he saw a figure moving toward him, the familiar gait of someone who had watched over him since infancy. His heart surged with a mixture of fear and longing, for he did not know whether he would be met with anger, disappointment, or joy. But in that moment, he realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Every step forward was a step toward redemption, and with it came the quiet knowledge that true repentance is as much about inward transformation as outward action. The prodigal son was no longer the brash youth who had demanded freedom and squandered blessings. He was a man who had faced the consequences of his choices, who had reflected deeply on his own flaws, and who now embraced the vulnerability required to ask for mercy. His journey home was complete not in distance, but in intent, a deliberate act of humility, a manifestation of courage, and a testament to the power of turning back, seeking restoration, and walking once more into the embrace of love that had never truly abandoned him. As the young man's wary footsteps carried him closer to the familiar gates of home, a figure appeared in the distance, small at first against the sprawling courtyard, yet unmistakable in its presence. The father, who had risen early to tend to the household and survey the fields, had seen him long before the son could see the house itself, a shimmer of movement on the horizon drawing the father's gaze. In that instant, the father's heart leapt with a mixture of relief and anticipation, for he recognized the familiar gait, the hesitant steps, and the bowed posture of a son returning not in triumph but in humility. The sight stirred every emotion the father had held in quiet patience during the long absence: worry, hope, longing, and an unyielding love that had neither faltered nor diminished despite the years of separation. Without hesitation or concern for decorum, the father broke into a run, moving across the courtyard with the speed and fervor of a heart that could not contain its joy. The servants paused in their tasks, the lowing of distant animals fading into a hushed reverence as the father closed the distance between himself and the son who had wandered far and suffered much. The young man, overwhelmed by the mixture of exhaustion, shame, and anticipation, could hardly comprehend what he saw. The man who had nurtured, guided, and patiently waited for his return was moving toward him, not with judgment, not with reprimand, but with open arms, a visible manifestation of mercy that the son had only dared to hope for in dreams and prayers whispered in lonely nights. As the distance closed, the father's embrace enveloped him, not as a father chastising a wayward child, but as a soul reunited with what it had always loved, what it had always believed could not be lost. The son, collapsing into the arms that had once steadied him as a boy, felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden that had pressed upon him through hunger, humiliation, and regret. He had carried the memories of his transgressions like stones in a sack, each one a reminder of folly and sin. Yet in the arms of his father, the stones fell away, one by one, until his spirit felt lighter than it had since the day he first departed. The father, with tears that mirrored the relief and joy swelling in his heart, spoke not of anger, nor of lessons learned too late, but of love that had never wavered, a love that was patient, enduring, and absolute. He lifted the son from the ground, brushing away the dust and mud that had clung to him during his journey, and with deliberate care, he clothed him in a robe of finest fabric, a symbol of restoration, dignity, and the reinstatement of belonging. A ring was placed upon his hand, signifying authority, honor, and the inseparable bond between father and child. The gestures spoke of more than material restoration. They proclaimed that the past, with all its mistakes and missteps, could not sever the connection rooted in love and forgiveness. Word spread quickly through the household that the lost son had returned, and the air filled with anticipation and excitement. The servants, who had watched with quiet curiosity and perhaps a measure of skepticism, now joined in the preparation of a feast worthy of celebration. Tables were laden with bread, roasted meats, and fruits from the orchard, filling the house with the warm, savory aroma of abundance. The sounds of laughter and music, long absent during the years of separation, returned to the halls, wrapping the home in a tangible sense of joy and unity. The son, still recovering from the physical and emotional toll of his journey, looked upon the feast not as a reward for his past recklessness, but as an affirmation of acceptance, mercy, and love that demanded nothing in return but a willing heart. As he sat at the table, surrounded by family and servants, the father's gaze met his son's with quiet intensity, communicating everything that words could not capture: pride not in achievement but in return, relief not in wealth regained but in the restoration of a soul, and joy not in ceremony but in the intimate reunion of hearts. The young man realized, in a clarity born of suffering and reflection, that forgiveness does not operate on the scale of transactions or recompense. It operates in the realm of grace, where love is a force that can erase shame and elevate the humbled. The robe and ring were tangible symbols, but the embrace, the feast, and the father's eyes conveyed the greater truth. He was wholly restored, wholly accepted, wholly loved. The celebration continued into the evening, with music and dance, storytelling and laughter. Yet the heart of the story remained in the quiet moments in the father and son walking together through the garden, in the son's silent contemplation of mercy received, in the gentle instructions of the father about tending the fields and the house, not as punishment but as guidance. The prodigal son, who had left seeking independence and pleasure, now understood that the truest freedom lies not in what one possesses or where one roams, but in the security of being known, loved, and forgiven. The journey had been long, fraught with suffering, shame, and reflection. Yet in the reunion, the son glimpsed the eternal truth that love, when unconditional, transforms the lost into the found, the broken into the whole, and the humbled into the wise. As night fell and the candles flickered against the walls of the house, the father and son sat together in quiet conversation, no longer defined by past mistakes but by the renewal of trust, understanding, and affection. Every word spoken, every gesture exchanged, reinforced the profound lesson that mercy is a power that redeems, that forgiveness is not merely an act but a state of being, and that true love is expansive enough to restore even those who have strayed farthest from the path. The prodigal son, once lost in arrogance and desire, had returned not just to his father's house but to the fullness of belonging, the depth of compassion, and the enduring embrace of a love that neither time nor folly could ever diminish. Even as the household erupted in celebration for the return of the younger son, one figure remained apart, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, and his eyes sharp with disapproval. The older brother, who had remained loyal and obedient, who had tended the fields and carried out his duties without complaint, could not understand the rejoicing. His heart burned with resentment, and he could not comprehend why a son who had squandered everything and disgraced the family now received robes, a ring, and a feast. To him, it felt unfair, as though devotion and hard work were invisible, and the indulgence of folly was rewarded above all else. He refused to enter the celebration, standing at the edge of the courtyard, letting the sounds of laughter and music wash over him like an invisible wall he could not breach. His thoughts raged the years of loyalty he had given, the sacrifices he had made, and the quiet obedience he had maintained seemed to be dismissed in a single, grand act of forgiveness for someone who had abandoned all principles. In his life was governed by fairness, by justice, by the expectation that good behavior would yield reward, and now that order appeared overturned. He was blinded by anger and a sense of betrayal. Seeing his older son's discontent, the father approached him not with rebuke, but with gentle wisdom, understanding that his heart was clouded by human judgment, unable to yet grasp the larger truth. "My son," he said, his voice calm yet resonant, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours, but we must celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that the older son struggled to lift from his mind. The father's eyes, full of patience and understanding, met his son's gaze, reminding him that love and grace are not measured by deeds alone, nor are they earned through obedience. They are given freely, abundantly, without calculation, reflecting the boundless compassion of a heart that sees beyond the mistakes and focuses on restoration. For the older son, it was a revelation difficult to accept. All he had viewed the world through the lens of fairness and reward, measuring virtue in work, in diligence, and in loyalty. Yet here was his father, demonstrating that mercy and love operate on a different plane, one that transcends human expectations and judgments. It was not punishment for the obedient, nor indulgence for the wayward, but a manifestation of grace that seeks restoration above all else. In that moment, he began, slowly, to understand that obedience and labor, though noble, are not the ultimate currency of love. Compassion, mercy, and forgiveness are, and they can transform lives in ways that justice alone cannot achieve. The household continued its celebration, but the older son remained in quiet contemplation, wrestling with the tension between his sense of fairness and the truth of grace. He thought of his younger brother, not as the reckless, indulgent boy who had left, but as someone restored, renewed, and embraced by a love that refused to give up. The resentment that had burned in his chest softened, replaced by a tentative curiosity, a cautious openness to the possibility that there is a greater order, one that values reconciliation and healing above judgment and reward. This story, while centered on the prodigal son, extends its lesson far beyond the boundaries of a single family. It challenges the listener to reflect on their own hearts. How often do we withhold compassion because we believe it must be earned? How often do we judge those who stray, failing to recognize the profound power of mercy and forgiveness? The parable reminds us that human judgment is limited, often rigid and unforgiving, while the love of God, represented in the Father's embrace, knows no bounds, offering restoration to all who turn with humility and repentance. The older son's struggle mirrors the struggle within each of us, the tension between fairness and grace, between what we think is deserved and what is freely given. Yet the story does not leave him in anger. It offers a path toward understanding, showing that acceptance of mercy requires a shift of perspective, a surrender of pride, and the willingness to rejoice in the restoration of others, even when we feel overlooked or undervalued. It is a call to expand our hearts, to see that joy and forgiveness are not zero-sum, that the happiness of one lost and found does not diminish the value of loyalty, and that love, when abundant, has room for all. As the night descended and the sounds of celebration echoed across the courtyard, the father's words lingered in the air, reaching even the heart of the reluctant older son. We must celebrate, for life has been restored, and what was broken has been made whole. In that moment, the older son felt the first stirrings of acceptance, the understanding that mercy is not a gift to be rationed, but a force that redeems and transforms. and though the path toward full joy and understanding might be gradual, the story leaves him and the listener with the profound truth that love freely given surpasses the narrow limits of judgment, that forgiveness can heal what pride and resentment cannot, and that the heart willing to embrace mercy will always find itself enriched beyond measure. Thank you so much for listening to this timeless story of forgiveness and grace. If you found inspiration in the journey of the prodigal son, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell to join us for more stories from the Bible that illuminate hope, mercy, and the power of love in our everyday lives.